Hola, bienvenidos a esta nueva conferencia. Hoy vamos a abrir la 17ª conferencia de nuestro ciclo que hemos llamado Sostenibilidad y Crecimiento, y que los más habituales, nuestros fans, los que estéis preocupados por el futuro del planeta, ya sabéis que hemos entrevistado y hemos conocido a relevantes personajes de todo el mundo y además especializados cada uno de ellos en distintas materias. Este es el cuarto año de este ciclo que hemos querido impulsar desde la vanguardia, y que agradecemos a nuestros lectores de nuestro diario que nos sigáis con mucha atención. En la edición de hoy vamos a hablar con Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Es referente internacional en desarrollo sostenible, energía, finanzas sostenibles y sistemas complejos, y actualmente es copresidenta del Club de Roma. Esta organización, que se fundó en el 1968, analiza los límites del crecimiento y tiene en consideración que los recursos naturales de la Tierra son limitados, una de las cuestiones que ya hemos ido hablando durante todos estos ciclos. Hoy, bajo la iniciativa Earth for All, trabajan en acelerar el cambio del sistema para llegar a un futuro equitativo en el planeta, en este planeta finito. Sandrine es profesora, escritora y divulgadora. Ha sido una de las promotoras de la publicación Plan de Emergencia Planetaria, y recientemente ha publicado el libro Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity, donde define los 5 pasos para empezar a transformar el sistema de cara al año 2050. También fue facilitadora del grupo de trabajo Acción en Bosques y Uso de la Tierra en la COP26. Por lo tanto, vamos a saludar desde Barcelona, y creo que está en Bélgica, a nuestra invitada de hoy, Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Buenos días.
Good morning. ¿Cómo estás?
Bueno, pues cuando usted quiera puede, como siempre hacemos, hacernos su presentación, explicarnos pues su punto de vista sobre este asunto que nos preocupa tanto, y después iniciaremos una conversación a partir de lo que usted nos explique. Adelante cuando quiera.
Thank you. Well, let me present to you the Club of Rome, and I have the esteemed pleasure of being the co-president of the Club of Rome since actually the last 5 years. The Club of Rome, since 1968, has continued to base its vision on looking at an interconnected world that has emerged from multiple emergencies, with a new way of being human that promotes well-being for all in a healthier ecosystem. And our founder, Aurelio Pache, very much wanted the Club of Rome to continuously unpack the human problematique and understand how human beings can live in harmony with the planet. If you look at the way in which we've tried since The Limits to Growth, our seminal publication in 1972, to really understand the complex problems troubling all men and women of all nations, poverty in the midst of plenty, degradation of the environment, loss of faith of institutions, and uncontrolled urban spread. Looking at the key issues around economic deterioration and the deterioration of well-being for many of our populations in comparison to growing wealth in the hands of but a few. It's very interesting to think that these words were pronounced already in 1972, and that we now, today, need to understand the 21st century complexities based on the same issues that we already perceived in 72. But obviously, within a context of time is running out, that we are in the midst of an emergency. So how can we take what we've learned in 1968 and 1972 through the limits to growth to today? What we've done as the Club of Rome is we've grown to 150 members of scientists, economists, experts across 34 national associations, have published a series of reports and publications, many of which have found ground selling and actually very important in setting the tone of new thinking, have a global network of partners and collaborators, and today have translated all of that theory and that deep thinking into 5 key impact hubs with multiple projects. What we very much want to do through the Club of Rome and to understand both our vision and our mission is to apply holistic, interdisciplinary, and long-term thinking for broader societal and planetary well-being. And I've just gotten off a Zoom call, for example, with the European Commission on a new project of Beyond GDP. And what does that look like? So how do we influence policy? How do we move towards more equitable economic, financial, and socio-political models? How do we ensure an inclusive human dimension to all systems change and a holistic approach? And then most importantly, how do we emerge from emergency? And this is what's so important in our impact hubs. Our impact hubs, which actually are, and I'm trying to move the next slide, and for some reason it's not working. Let's see if we can do it this way. No, there seems to be a blockage. There we go. Our impact hubs harness the diversity of our understanding and our intelligence and our activities around the perspectives of our different members and the ecosystems to which we belong. And they serve as a creative impact space where members of the Club of Rome and partners and associations can come together and share transformational thought leadership and co-design new solutions. So we have 5 key impact hubs, and they're all interrelated in their thinking and in their acting. We start with the vision of where we want to go, the emerging new civilizations. And within that consideration, the role of youth leadership and intergenerational dialogues in our hub that works directly with youth and is led by youth. But then we think about, well, what are the 3 key areas that must be transformed? One is understanding the planetary emergency, the impact both of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the human dimension. And that is our planetary emergency hub. But then underpinning the planetary emergency is the need for reframing our economic models and understanding and rethinking our finance models. So we're not just financing change, but we're changing finance. If we look quickly, because I know that we want to dig deeper into climatic impacts at what we're doing in terms of the planetary emergency, what we're trying to do is raise awareness of the need for integrated responses to the interconnected challenges of humanity's facing climate change, biodiversity loss, and growing social inequity. So we've got a planetary emergency plan, and we published this plan 4 years ago with chief scientists and economists from across the globe. And then we've put in place a partnership around that plan. And within that partnership, we are calling for new climate governance. How do we reform the COPs, for example, so they stop being trade shows? How do we make sure that we put in place 10 key systems change principles to policymakers that take into consideration all elements of climate change, from the human dimension, adaptation and vulnerabilities, all the way through, obviously, the loss of biodiversity and greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation? What type of changes do we need at the policy level? And how do we protect our most important policies, like the nature restoration law that today is under attack? How do we transform our urban-rural food systems? We know that land use and food and forestry are very important in the way in which we ensure access to sustainable food that is affordable, but also we protect our forests. And then what is the impact of our built environment? What is the impact, obviously, of our energy use, but also our housing and our materials use? Within this context, we very much are looking at what is the timeline and how can we make this actionable in the next decade, because we call this the decade of action. And as I have said so many times, without rapid and radical transformation, the COP process, our large negotiations, will fail to deliver a safe climate landing for humanity. We have a series of different proposals, 10 urgent actions for transformation that very much go to the heart of ensuring that we have a just and equitable society, that we have an energy transition, and that we have a new regenerative and circular economy. But underpinning this is a real need for a shift in economics, and that's why the reframing economics work is so important. We have a collaborative effort aimed at transforming our economic systems to achieve well-being for all. And this encompasses looking at new well-being economic models, moving beyond growth and beyond GDP with the UN, the OECD, and the European Commission. It means participation in initiatives that are shifting educational models, and also new economic thinking and movement building, both in the US and in Europe. And most importantly, our most recent work, Earth for All, which commemorated the limits to growth, but brought us to the next level of what type of specific models we need to reach a more equitable Earth for all. This is based on the planetary boundaries science that my chief scientist friend, Johan Rockström, and also a key author of Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity, has put forward as the planetary boundaries framework. How can we stay within the planetary boundaries? And we know that we've already surpassed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and ensure that we reduce inequality and that we actually heighten people's lives and livelihoods towards well-being. It also means that we translate this within the core of SDG thinking, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the work that we've been doing with the UN. What we've come up with are 2 key scenarios. And these 2 key scenarios are the too little too late scenario, which is the scenario of business as usual, or the giant leap scenario. How can we create a resilient society of the future? And this only costs us, if we put in place the giant leap scenario, 2 to 4% of global income, which is needed to invest in a better future. This is the analysis, and only one of the spaghetti analyses we call, or the system dynamic analysis that we've undertaken. The relationship between social tipping points, environmental tipping points, social tension, well-being, labor, but also obviously greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. And what we have found, which is so important, is that the speed of action on planetary boundaries is a function of the speed of action on inequality and poverty. So inequality and poverty are fundamental parts of our societies that we must make sure are improved if we're going to actually meet the planetary boundary science that is so important for us and stay within the boundaries of our planet. And what we see with the giant leap in this particular graph is that already by 2040, we're able, through the giant leap, which is the blue bar, to get to a deep, deep reduction in inequality, but not with the too little too late scenario, where we see that actually inequality continues to grow. We also see that because of this, we have a reduction in emissions with a giant leap. So we can see that our greenhouse gas emissions are fundamentally reduced already in 2040 and halved in comparison to the too little too late scenario. What's very important is that because of this, we have a reduction in social tension. So actually people are living better, greenhouse gas emissions have reduced, inequality has actually reduced, and therefore social tension is reduced, which means that we have more space to put in place democratic processes and for governments to work in sync with people to make sure that we have a better living environment. And this is what we call then the well-being index. This means that through the giant leap, and you can see the blue line, which is the giant leap, we continue to move up in terms of well-being. Whereas the too little too late scenario, already through 2020, if we don't apply our 5 key turnarounds of ensuring a decrease in inequality, a decrease in poverty, an insurance of empowerment of women who are more part of the economy, and also access to education in parts where this does not happen, plus a shift with our food system and our energy system, we will not achieve this well-being for all. So ladies and gentlemen, what's been incredible is this work has now been translated in 10 languages. And in fact, it's just been translated in Spanish as well, where we actually launched our book in Argentina, and we look forward to launching it also in Spain with regard to this very important thinking. It also has led to a series of deep dives around how can we truly shift from a growth scenario through solidarity and equity, for example, or how do we look at social dividends? And all of this is on our website. But most importantly, I want to be very clear that in my speeches and my discussions, even in Wall Street, at the heart of the New York Stock Exchange, where I indicated that if we continue with an over-financialized economy, we will crowdfund disaster. It is time to change the rules of the game so people, planet, and prosperity come first before power and profit. And the only way that we can build resilience to future shocks and stresses is to invest in an earth for all. We fundamentally believe as scientists and economists, and I am convinced that there will not be any stocks or bonds or financial assets, no business prospects or competitiveness or on an unstable dead planet. We have no choice but to redesign our systems towards a regenerative development that fosters well-being for all on an earth for all. Thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchas gracias a Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Ella, como hemos dicho, es copresidenta del Club de Roma y está impulsando estas líneas de trabajo a nivel mundial para que entendamos que hay que ir rápido, que hay que dar el gran salto y no, como acaba de decir, ir demasiado lento, porque entonces no avanzaremos. A partir de lo que nos ha explicado, me sugieren varias preguntas que le iré trasladando, pero empiezo por este último aspecto de que en Wall Street y las empresas, ¿no? Dices, Sandrine Dixon, que hay que convencerlas de que hay que dar ese gran salto. Usted, cuando dice eso, ¿ha hablado con estas grandes corporaciones, estas grandes empresas? Y si lo ha hecho, que me imagino que sí, ¿qué les transmiten? ¿Adoptan ese mensaje o son reticentes a hacerlo?
Thank you for that question. Of course, I also sit on a series of corporate boards and have discussions with investors every day. And some understand. Some understand that as they are fathers or mothers and see the climate impacts and understand the realities of the feedback loops, that really we do need to change. The problem is that we continue to perpetuate a system that enables for profit and productivity to actually take control over real well-being and life satisfaction increases across Europe, the United States, and of course the global South. So there is a deep pushback from the big incumbents, those that have the most to gain from today's society. The oil and gas sector that are making 2.8 billion profits per day. The investments that are actually going out and looking only at short-term investments rather than at long-term investment in a brighter future. It's a hard struggle. And so this question is so important, because how do we convince investors, corporates to change their practices? I fundamentally believe that very few will come willingly. And that is why we need to put in place the policy, the regulation, but also the shift in the GDP indicators to bring in other indicators so that we actually move away from only looking at productivity as the only measure of well-being, because we know that productivity does not automatically translate to well-being for the majority, but actually increasingly only for the few.
Esas normativas, esas leyes, tienen que aplicarlas los gobiernos, obviamente. los gobiernos muchas veces vienen condicionados por los lobbies económicos. ¿Cómo se rompe esa dinámica para que los gobiernos puedan implantar esas normativas que a veces no son bien acogidas por esas grandes corporaciones, porque pueden ver que cambia el paradigma y por lo tanto ellos tienen que hacer una modificación en su línea económica y financiera? ¿Cómo se hace esa?
Yeah, there are some subtle shifts that we're starting to see that we really need to grab onto. One, for example, is the new discussion around wealth taxation. And what we're seeing is more and more countries, and also even some corporations. We work with patriotic millionaires, for example, Warren Buffett, who admits that it's not normal that his housekeeper is taxed more than he is taxed. We see governments now working in the OECD that are calling for wealth taxation. This already is a shift, which is fundamental, because it will then enable, if we bring together that capital, to invest it differently. That's one small, subtle shift. The other key important point is now with the European elections. This is the moment, actually, to seize the European elections and call for bravery and a new leadership at the European level, even though we know that probably we will be shifting more towards the radical right. What we're seeing is that within the European Commission and within discussions, even with different parties, that there is a live conversation around how can we enhance the lives and livelihoods of European citizens. And so we need to bring economists and scientists together within those conversations and citizens to push for a new leadership. But we will need bravery, and we will need leaders to understand that they have no choice. That if we continue, we will have a spiral effect of actually GDP will continue to go down because of the poly crisis, because of the pandemics, which we will continue to have, climate change impacts. And so we need to rethink the way in which we structure our economy so it becomes more resilient to those impacts. Only going towards productivity will not enable us to do that.
Acaba de introducir, efectivamente, estamos a muy pocos días, semanas de las elecciones europeas y justamente el tema del cambio climático ha aparecido históricamente y sobre todo muy recientemente en los discursos políticos, pero de la pura observación de por dónde van las políticas de los grandes países europeos, estamos viendo, no sé si usted tiene la misma opinión, una involución, como un paso atrás o algún paso atrás, porque nos estamos fijando, estamos muy condicionados por la situación de guerra en Ucrania, las inversiones están yendo más hacia defensa y algunos países como Alemania está volviendo al carbón, Francia está haciendo una apuesta por la energía nuclear, el tema del diésel ha habido como un debate de tampoco vayamos tan rápido, ¿no? Lo que usted decía del too late, parece que los signos políticos que se están transmitiendo son como de freno, que Europa frena, cuando ha sido Europa durante los últimos años la que ha mantenido un cierto liderazgo en la lucha contra el cambio climático. ¿Usted lo ve así también?
No, what you have just shown is absolutely correct. And this is truly problematic. Even 6 months ago, I wouldn't have predicted the quick pushback that we're seeing on the European Green Deal and on climate. But I think that we need to be very careful. And my discussions directly with the European leadership, from prime ministers and presidents all the way to the European Commission leadership, has been very clear. First of all, if you look at all new surveys, the consumer and the citizen is ready to do its part for climate change. Climate change is still one of the key issues that concerns citizens in Europe. But what is happening, let's be very careful. We know that there are Putin proxies, that there are bots, that there are ways in which the information is being manipulated right now to seed chaos in Europe and to start to create this move and this fear, which the radical right is taking control of. We have to be very careful not to fall into that fear. So the first point is citizens believe that climate change is one of the most urgent issues. Citizens, again from these surveys, are ready to pay for climate impacts and ensure that actually we stop climate change. But what does that mean in practice? That means that economically, we need to support citizens in a just transition. And we need to communicate as leaders, as economists, as scientists, that we can both grow differently, develop economically with our social and environmental values at the same time, and show how this can happen. We also, and this is what I say to the leadership, I am sorry, I have grown up in the United States. The American dream is dead. If you go to American cities today, they have the highest homelessness rate. They have the highest drug addiction rate. Our European cities are not yet there because we have been able to continue with European values. This competitiveness desire by European leaders against the United States and China has to be translated into a strong economic model that is based on European values of both social and environmental criteria. And we have already shown that through our social system and through our environmental system, we can decouple our greenhouse gas emissions and we can continue to develop economically. And that is what we need to continue to stick to and not get caught up in the fear that is being produced by Russia and also by the radical right in our countries.
Por lo tanto, ¿usted cree que en estas elecciones, según el resultado que salga, podemos vernos ante una Europa que frena en su vocación histórica de luchar contra el cambio climático, o que frena si se da un resultado, o que puede tener la esperanza de dar ese gran salto al que usted se refería antes? ¿Nos jugamos eso en estas elecciones?
Absolutely. I think the question is, do we fall into the trap of thinking that the American way is the best way? Or do we actually continue with our path, our European Green Deal, and unpack it so that it's actually implementable? I would focus on that. Let's optimize our economies. When Macron talks about simplification, I say simplification means optimization, not getting rid of the European Green Deal, but getting rid of some of the requirements which might be too harsh, the reporting requirements which industry is telling us is too much, or the fact that we have a lot of red tape in terms of infrastructure investment for renewables. How can we enhance the transition rather than bog it down and make it more complicated? And I think together we can find solutions to enhance this transformation by also continuously communicating with people and citizens and enabling them to have greater purchasing power and also not to get impacted so much by the current inflationary impacts, the energy poverty, and also the food poverty that we're seeing. We need to get better at thinking through how do we actually enhance our market, get rid of the subsidies that are actually subsidizing polluting energy and high carbon energy, and transform those trillions of dollars to subsidies that will enable people to thrive, not just survive.
Por lo tanto, se trata de discurso, de afinar en un discurso en que la ciudadanía, el mensaje que reciba no es que la lucha contra el cambio climático te complica la vida, te la va a hacer más cara, te la va a hacer un poco más difícil, sino intentar que se combine aquello de que la ecología no está reñida con la economía y que pueden convivir conjuntamente y que con esa conciencia podamos todos avanzar sin ver ese fantasma, ¿no? Ahí los divulgadores como Sandrine Dixon y otros muchos veo que su discurso no va por ahí, pero hemos escuchado otros discursos que son un poco más agresivos, han ido más tremendistas, más findemontistas, ¿no? Del fin del mundo. ¿Eso ha podido influir también en la opinión pública de cuando hablamos del cambio climático? Quieran decir, bueno, no me compliques la vida, déjame un poco tranquilo. ¿Puede ser que haya influido ese discurso y que se tenga que hacer una autorreflexión desde la defensa del cambio, de la lucha contra el cambio climático en relación a los mensajes que se emiten?
Absolutely. I think the narrative is key. On the one hand, we have the Greta narrative, the climate change is going to kill us all, and we are desperate, we, the next generation, which is a very valid narrative, but has created all kinds of eco-anxiety. Or we have the climate elitist narrative, that actually climate is an elitist issue. It's about polar bears. It's not about my life. And they're both wrong. Because climate change and nature protection is what's going to keep us alive if we're careful. And we need to talk about a positive narrative, but a realistic narrative, which is we are doing many things which are creating the greatest existential risk to all of us. But we also have many solutions. And what we need is the bravery to take on those solutions. As I said, the giant leap scenario only costs us global annual GDP of 2 to 4%. That is the equivalent, and I would even say less than, the defense budget in many countries. And yet what we're seeing is that we're seeing a turn towards an enhancing of defense funding and moving out of climate funding. My very clear narrative and message on this is defense funding is a very short-term defense and security enabler. What we need is a long-term plan, because climate change is our greatest security risk if we're not careful. That doesn't mean you don't address defense, but you also address the long-term of how do you ensure that you reduce migration by working with countries in the global south to enhance their development strategies, to reduce their impacts and adapt actually to carbon effects so that they can actually be thriving in their own countries. That you come up with solutions in terms of trade deficits, that you think through debt cancellation, that you work within a European Union that is truly a union where we exchange technology between East and West and South, and that we enhance the transfer of energy across all of Europe, whether you're producing wind or you're producing renewables. This is an exciting prospect for Europe. It goes back to our post-war Grand Marshall Plan of how we thought about rebuilding Europe. This is not only about rebuilding Europe, it's about thinking through how Europe can truly be a leader of the type of world that we want, that brings in social and environmental values. It forces us to think constructively, to unify, to be more in a solidarity perspective, but also to bring in deep innovation and optimize all of our knowledge, our technology, our governance systems, our social systems to enhance the lives of every single human being living in Europe and beyond. That's exciting narrative.
Usted ha dicho una cosa que es importante, que es y que me sugieren dos preguntas. Una es en el tema migratorio. Justamente Europa está siendo un punto de recepción de la inmigración. En España lo sabemos bien, y en Italia, en Grecia, que son la frontera natural con África. Pero ¿estamos haciendo lo suficiente para que se frene esta inmigración por la vía de ayudar en origen a esos países a que tengan una economía de futuro y que además no solamente económicamente sino también climáticamente? Europa y el mundo está ayudando realmente, más allá de los discursos, a que ese sur global salga de ese agujero económico y de poco futuro?
No, we're absolutely not helping. And that's why we've been very clear in terms of our recommendations from the Club of Rome and also from Earth for All. In fact, recently, we just signed a letter on debt cancellation with 40 economists from Africa. We've been saying you have to create the fiscal space to enable these countries to transition. For the moment, they are all suffocating from debt. There is absolutely no way that they can finance the transition. That's one thing. But then secondly, how through our trade partnerships, through our development partnerships, can we work to co-design a new vision for these countries, many of which actually are the youngest countries because they have the most youthful population. Africa is thriving with a great deal of innovation. How can we work with this new generation of Africans that have such incredible innovative ideas and keep those ideas in Africa to actually sustain Africa? That's our responsibility. That is a very deep post-colonial responsibility where we admit to our flaws as Europeans and work directly to co-design, working with Africans who are really showing a new type of leadership, especially in the young generation, and who have this new vision that we need to supply. And maybe one last point, let us not forget that we could all be refugees. We've seen what's happening in Spain, as you've said, and in the south of Europe. Many of those in southern Spain are suffering from obviously drought and fires. Even in Belgium, we've seen flooding. Every single one of us can be a refugee. And so we need to understand that now the refugee issue is not just about Africans coming over. It is potentially about Southern Spaniards who are moving to the north of Spain or potentially to Belgium or to the west of Europe. How do we deal with those situations within our own union? And what does that look like in terms of better collaboration and understanding of climate risks?
Y luego este sistema de migraciones también estamos observando, bueno, es obvio que lo que está haciendo es la concentración de la población en las ciudades y el abandono de lo que llamamos el mundo rural. ¿Esto es imparable o hay alguna manera de que se revierta?
So it's interesting because during COVID, we saw that so many of our urban dwellers were going back to rural areas. We've also seen more and more youth want to get involved in permaculture or in regenerative agriculture and setting up new farms. I fundamentally believe that part of our empowerment process across Europe has to be about empowering rural communities, bringing young people back to rural communities, making farming exciting again and economically possible again. And this comes in understanding where can we create these transitions and enable actually the young people and rural communities to truly thrive. How do we also ensure that we have rural urban communities through what I call green corridors, enabling the production of regenerative food and more affordable food, and making sure that the urban communities understand their dependency on rural communities, so that these rural communities feel that they're part of a broader ecosystem. That is very important because we have to remember that the more disenfranchised our rural communities are, the more then they are liable to vote towards the radical right, because they are disenfranchised, dehumanized, and feel that they are very much being looked down upon by our urban communities.
Hablando de Europa y hablando también de este sentimiento, ¿no?, de la ciudadanía europea, le quería plantear otro dilema que también tienen los ciudadanos, o algunos de ellos, en Europa, que es, en Europa estamos haciendo un gran esfuerzo en materia de la lucha contra el cambio climático, un esfuerzo, digamos, razonable, pero como hay otros países en el planeta y el planeta no entiende, nuestro aire no entiende de fronteras entre países. Hay otros países que son emisores mayores de gases invernadero o de elementos contaminantes, que ellos no están haciendo ese mismo esfuerzo, y entonces estoy hablando de Estados Unidos y estoy hablando de Oriente en China, ¿no? Entre otros. Entonces, ¿por qué tenemos que seguir nosotros haciendo un esfuerzo en casa, en nuestra Europa pequeña y vieja, si luego los dos grandes gigantes hacen lo que quieren y acabamos contaminando y perjudicando el planeta? ¿Cómo se responde a esa reflexión que pueden hacer muchos ciudadanos europeos?
So there are different nuances to your question and to this very important perception of the rest of the world. The first is actually, if you look at the United States and the Inflation Reduction Act, it's probably the largest shift in a US policy that we've ever seen to move towards decarbonization. In fact, what industry is saying today is that the US IRA is actually much more progressive than the European Green Deal. So we immediately see that actually the United States is moving forward. China has invested more in renewable energy than any other country and has become the leader. So again, the greatest polluters of the globe have actually followed Europe. The question is, will Europe keep up? Because now they're going much faster. But where the power is those multinationals that do not want the world to change. The oil and gas companies that have gone backwards, that actually were starting to shift towards renewables and now have been very candid in the fact that they want to continue to make 2.8 billion and more windfall profits per day, and that they will not shift. But what's interesting there is we're starting to see, for example, now with Exxon and Shell and others, that it's the shareholders that are starting to hold them accountable, that are starting to say, hold on, we can't continue this way. So we are in a bit of this phase of moving several feet forward and then moving backwards, back and forth and back and forth. And that is because those that are in power are realizing that they're starting to lose that power and they're not happy. And that is where we have to become, as a broader community of experts and economists and decision makers and scientists, much more forceful in the way in which we demand a change in our society in order to make sure that we truly thrive and survive. And that is holding those companies accountable. And that is putting in place the right policies, making sure that they pay up their taxes, that we distribute that wealth, that we shift away from an extractive economy, and that we start to really redistribute the wealth globally, including the materials and the natural resources, so that citizens can profit, not just those that have the greatest power and the multinationals. And so my reaction to your question and to the perception of so many people is, first, the world is moving and we're seeing that there is great movement in the greatest polluters, but do not underestimate those that have always made the most money on the backs of growing energy poverty and growing food poverty. And those are the ones that we must stop. And that's the big multinationals.
Hay una pregunta básica, que se puede hacer negocio, es decir, puede haber beneficios y las empresas pueden ganarse bien la vida siendo sostenibles y siendo conscientes de que lo que hacen va contra el planeta o va a favor del planeta. Es decir, se les puede convencer de que pueden seguir teniendo esa actividad económica y esos accionistas teniendo sus beneficios haciendo las cosas de otra manera.
Listen, I think that we need to get out of this model of margins and growth at such high rates in order to continue to do business. you know that there is a disconnect between the economy and servicing people's needs and the current financial system today. Basically, shareholders determine everything. And that is the biggest issue that we have. It's these margins that shareholders are asking for. If you look at our research and our analysis, in the United States alone, since 1978, salaries for CEOs have grown by 1,400%. 1,400%. Now, you cannot tell me that those billionaires and millionaires that are CEOs need all of that money. Very importantly, employee salaries have grown by 18%. And inflation has grown by more than 18% in many countries. So we have to get out of this system of thinking that actually today's economy is truly trickling down. It's not. It's staying in the hands of the few, and actually they are also the most responsible for the emissions that are being polluting, and greenhouse gas emissions, that is the key issue. So we see that there is a possibility of a conversation with businesses who understand that actually this needs to shift. It's not about those exponential margins. It's about enabling businesses to continue to prosper while they also are responsible for prosperity on the planet. And that is why that speech that I gave at Wall Street was so important, because we have to remember there are no jobs, there are no stocks, no bonds, there are no CEOs on a dead planet. At the end of the day, we have to now plan within the current constraints that we have. And that means doing business differently. And it means that maybe the wealthiest will finally have to think about redistribution. They're still going to get money in their pockets, but they won't get the 1,400% differential that they were so used to.
Hay una trampa que ya toda la población ha detectado, y afortunadamente también hay leyes, que es el denominado greenwashing, ¿no? Las empresas pues buscan la manera de escapar de la normativa para aparentar que están haciendo, que lo están haciendo bien, cuando en realidad es solo atrezzo, es solo el aparador, porque luego detrás lo que hay es lo mismo, aunque maquillado, ¿no? ¿Estamos venciendo el greenwashing? ¿Cree que estamos ya en buena línea, tanto normativamente como luego efectivamente?
So this again is where we're starting to see the pain points. And again, when you introduce a real shift, there will be a propensity to break the rules. Some companies are truly trying to embed a shift within their business models. And I sit on some of the utilities at the European level who are really pulling out of coal, who have put in place just transition plans in Spain and in Portugal, for example. If you look at Iberdrola, Acciona, but also EDP, these are utilities that are trying to start to really shift towards green power. But the fact of the matter is that there are many companies that are absolutely greenwashing. And that's why we just saw recently, in terms of the science-based targets, that many of them were kicked out of the science-based rating, and that there are many others that have been kicked out. So we do need to be vigilant, and we need to think through, what does it mean to be a responsible and green producer of both services and of products? And yes, we need to hold accountable those companies that are actually greenwashing. I mean, a perfect example is Shell. I worked with Shell for many, many years. In the 1980s and through 2000, Shell was one of the most active companies working on climate change as an oil and gas producer. But more and more we have seen that it was absolute greenwashing. That on the one hand, they were engaging on climate negotiations, and on the other hand, they were trying to push negotiators away from coming across a deal on climate change. So we have to be vigilant as scientists, economists, decision makers, and as citizens to hold our multinationals and our companies accountable.
Ya vamos acabando, pero en nuestras conversaciones de este ciclo de sostenibilidad siempre tenemos una fecha, que es 2050. Y ese año nos marca un poco el punto de no retorno, ¿no? El punto de inflexión. ¿Cree que con todo lo que estamos haciendo, o lo poco o mucho que estamos haciendo, estamos on time, estamos en la línea de poder llegar al 2050 con esperanza, o estamos ya muy al límite de cumplir ese calendario?
So as I indicated in our analysis, the Earth for All report shows that the too little too late scenario is today's scenario. If we are not more forthright in terms of applying our 2050 targets, then we will not meet our 2050 targets. We already know today that we are very close to 1.5 degrees. We're at about 1.3 degrees. This year alone, many days, we bypassed 2 degrees. And we're seeing all the impacts. I mean, here in Belgium, we've had 4 months of non-stop rain, whereas in other parts of the world, it's been an absolute disaster where there has been no rain. These impacts are happening across the globe because of the instability created by climate change. So we must act now. And that is why we have to stick to our objectives. We have to continue year on year reducing our impact and our greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have to put in place those resilience and adaptation factors that are necessary so that people actually can continue to live while we have more of these impacts. Because we will have more pandemics, also created by climate change, and we will have more climate effects. So I don't like to say that we are absolutely too late. I think there is a margin now of chance, and that's why we call this the decade of action. Before 2030, we have to make sure that we are very ambitious and that we work together with countries across the globe to really hit our objectives and our targets of reaching actually greenhouse gas reductions.
Pues estamos en la década de la acción, estamos casi en la mitad de la década, ¿eh? O sea que nos queda poco tiempo y no podemos perder el tiempo. Lo vamos a dejar aquí. Muchas gracias a Sandrine Dixson-Declève, que es la copresidenta del Club de Roma y gran conocedora de todo lo que se está haciendo en la lucha del cambio climático y también de todo lo que no se está haciendo, que es donde creo que debemos de poner el foco y es lo que estamos haciendo en estos ciclos de conferencias. Le agradezco mucho que haya compartido este rato con nuestros lectores, con nuestros oyentes y espero que el futuro sea bueno, que nos concienciamos todos de que lleguemos a ese 2050 cumpliendo el objetivo. Muchas gracias y hasta la próxima.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.